My name is Margaret Harris, but most people simply call me Maggie. I am a woman who has lived long enough to understand one truth. Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness. That truth became painfully clear on the day I buried my husband, Thomas. The chapel was silent, filled with that heavy air only funerals carry. The organ hummed softly in the background, and I sat in the front pew wearing a simple black dress. It was modest, cut with care, nothing flashy, just a quiet symbol of respect for the man I had loved for more than 30 years. Yet, in that sacred silence, someone decided to turn grief into theater. My daughter-in-law, Brittany, chose that moment to draw attention to what she thought was a cheap dress. Her words carried across the chapel like a slap. The weight of her disdain pressed harder than the grief already crushing my chest. I sat still, hands folded, eyes lowered, as if wounded. But in truth, I wasn't broken. I was waiting. That dress Brittany mocked so loudly was not cheap at all. It was a custom design worth $8,000. Every button was mother of pearl, each one costing $500. My shoes were handmade pumps, $12,000 of craftsmanship, and Brittany had no idea she had just mocked the woman who owned the very company signing her paychecks. I chose silence that day, but silence is not surrender. And this is where my story truly begins. I can still feel the sting of that moment inside the chapel. The air was heavy with sorrow, yet Brittany's voice cut through it with sharp edges, as if grief itself wasn't enough. She looked at me with eyes that measured fabric and seams instead of heart and soul. In her mind, my dress wasn't worthy of the occasion, and she wanted everyone to know it. I sat motionless. My son, Ethan, shifted in his seat, uneasy, while my daughter Claire reached for my hand, her quiet way of saying she saw me. But Brittany thrived on silence. She fed on the lack of confrontation, mistaking it for weakness. And the more I stayed still, the louder her performance became. In those minutes, I didn't cry because of Thomas. I cried because the values he and I built our lives on, respect, humility, dignity, were being trampled under the weight of her arrogance. My tears were hot, not from grief, but from anger carefully restrained. The irony was sharp enough to make me almost smile. Each mother-of-pearl button on that so-called cheap dress cost $500. The shoes on my feet were custom-made for $12,000. And yet, those details were never the point. They only mattered because Brittany worked for the very company Thomas and I had built from scratch, the company that quietly paid her salary each month. As I sat there in silence, I realized how often appearances deceive. People looked at me and saw a widow in a plain black dress. They didn't see the years of sacrifice, the empire Thomas and I created, the fortune tucked away behind modest choices. They only saw what they wanted to see. But I remembered his voice in my heart. Thomas always told me not to confuse kindness with weakness. He used to say that true strength doesn't need to shout. And so, I didn't shout that day. I folded my grief, my anger, and my pride into silence. But silence can be a powerful seed, and I knew it was only a matter of time before it grew into something Brittany would never expect. That evening, when the house finally fell silent, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat alone at the kitchen table. The shadows felt heavier without Thomas, but his voice came back to me as clear as if he were still there. He used to remind me, over and over, that kindness is not weakness. I could almost hear him saying it again, steady and calm, urging me not to let anger steer my choices. I realized then that silence at the funeral had not been defeat. It had been the opening move in something larger. I didn't need to raise my voice or trade insults. My strength had always been in restraint, in patience, in letting truth reveal itself at the right time. As I sat there, I thought about the life Thomas and I built together. We started with a rented stall and long nights of hard work, believing that respect mattered more than flash. That principle had carried us through every trial, and now it would guide me again. The time had come to act, but quietly, deliberately, and on my own terms. Late that night, I walked into the living room and stood in front of the old oak bookshelf. To anyone else, it looked ordinary, just rows of worn novels and framed family photos. But I knew its secret. I slid my hand along the familiar edge, pressed the hidden latch, and felt the weight shift as the shelf swung open. Behind it lay the part of my life few had ever seen. The air smelled faintly of cedar and leather, a quiet reminder of all the years Thomas and I had poured into building something from nothing. On the walls hung photographs of our earliest days, the ribbon cutting of our first boutique, the smiles that carried us through nights when we had nothing but determination. Stacks of contracts lined the cabinets, documents that told the story of how a rented stall became 17 boutiques and 3 textile factories. Fabric swatches and sketches rested on the wide mahogany desk, each one a fragment of the empire we had built together. I traced my fingers across one of the old contracts and felt Thomas beside me, steady and proud. Respect, not appearances, had always been the foundation. That night, I knew it was time to protect that principle once more. The funeral had been Brittany's stage, but now, it was my turn to step behind the curtain and set the real story in motion. The next morning, I reached for the phone that only a handful of people in my life knew existed. It wasn't the line for family or friends, it was the one I reserved for business. When my assistant, Maya Patel, answered, her voice carried both professionalism and quiet compassion. She knew Thomas had just passed, yet she also understood that I wouldn't be calling unless something mattered deeply. I asked her to pull the employee file for Brittany. I didn't need to explain why. Maya understood. Within hours, the truth began to unfold. Brittany had 3 written warnings for being late. There were notes about her dismissive tone with customers, and her supervisor had documented that she often acted as if she were above the very people she was meant to serve. But the paper trail didn't stop there. I requested a deeper look into her financial state, and what came back painted an even clearer picture. She and Ethan were living in an apartment that cost more than her entire salary could cover. Their credit card debt had ballooned to over $4,000. A car loan added another $22,000. Most shocking of all, they had just applied for a $4,000 mortgage, banking on a promotion Brittany was certain she would receive. It wasn't poverty fueling her arrogance. It was the performance of wealth, a house of cards waiting to collapse. I knew then that silence would no longer be enough. It was time to see her world up close. A few days later, I walked into our flagship boutique, dressed in the most unassuming way I could. A gray cardigan, simple flats, and a handbag so plain that no one would have guessed its true value. To the world, I looked like just another middle-aged woman stepping in off the street. That was exactly what I wanted. The store itself gleamed with soft lighting and polished marble floors. Associates moved gracefully, greeting clients with practiced warmth. But not Brittany. She leaned against the counter, her phone pressed to her ear, laughing far too loudly for the setting. A woman with silver hair stood nearby, waiting patiently to be helped. Yet Brittany ignored her completely. I stood quietly, observing. I didn't need to intervene. Her actions told me everything I already suspected. She dismissed clients who didn't fit her image of wealth and status. She had no idea that her every careless gesture was adding weight to the file already building against her. In that moment, I knew the time for quiet observation was almost over. The stage was being set for truth to walk in. I stood near the clearance rack, watching Brittany finally notice me. Her voice shifted into that sugary tone she used when she wanted to sound helpful. But I could feel the undercurrent of condescension. She reminded me, almost smugly, that this store was expensive, as if I might not belong. I stayed calm, letting her words pass over me. Then the moment came. The glass doors opened, and Maya entered. Her presence steady and commanding. She walked directly toward me and addressed me formally as Mrs. Harris. She told me the managers were waiting upstairs. The entire floor grew silent. I saw Brittany's face drain of color. She looked from Maya to me, searching for some explanation that would undo the truth unfolding before her. I straightened my shoulders and allowed the weight of reality to settle in. I was not just her mother-in-law. I was the founder and owner of Harris & Gray, the very company she had boasted about ruling once she earned her promotion. Maya began reading the documented incidents aloud. Ignored clients, wasted hours on her phone, disrespect toward customers who didn't look the part. Each word echoed through the store like a verdict. I didn't need anger. I didn't need cruelty. I only needed clarity. I reminded myself that appearances can deceive, but respect should never depend on titles or wealth. Around me, associates exchanged glances. The silence carried more weight than any outburst ever could. Brittany's career ended in that quiet moment, not because of who I was, but because of who she chose to be. For me, the confrontation was never about revenge. It was about protecting the values Thomas and I built our lives upon. And now, it was time for my son to see the truth as well. The day after the reveal, Ethan came to my apartment. His steps were heavy, his face drawn, as if he carried the weight of confusion and betrayal all at once. He had heard from Brittany, of course, but I knew he had not yet heard the truth from me. I led him into the living room where the oak bookshelf stood quietly against the wall. Without a word, I pressed the hidden latch. The shelf opened, revealing the study I had kept secret for so many years. Ethan froze in the doorway, his eyes scanning the photographs, the contracts, the financial ledgers that stretched back decades. I watched the realization settle on him. His mother was not the modest widow Brittany had mocked. I was the woman who, alongside his father, had built an empire brick by brick, choice by choice. I placed the file on the desk in front of him. Inside were the records of Brittany's behavior, the debts she had hidden, and the arrogance she carried into every room. I told him this not to break his heart, but to give him the truth. I reminded him gently that I could not choose his path, only lay out the values that had guided mine. The decision of what kind of man he wanted to be would always rest with him. As Ethan sat in that hidden study, his hands resting on the file, I could see the storm in his eyes. He wanted to defend Brittany, to cling to the picture he had of his marriage, but the evidence weighed too heavily. I didn't raise my voice, and I didn't press him. Instead, I reminded him of the values his father and I had carried through our entire lives: respect, humility, responsibility. Those were the cornerstones of everything we built, and they could not be compromised. I told him that if he truly wished to step into the world Thomas and I had created, It would never be handed to him. He would have to earn it, beginning on the sales floor like every other employee. He would learn what it meant to greet every customer with dignity, whether they spent $50 or $50,000. Only then could he understand the weight of what he stood to inherit. I made one promise: if wealth ever became a weapon in his hands, it would disappear. The fortune mattered little if the values behind it were lost. Weeks later, I walked into the flagship boutique again. Only this time, I wasn't there to observe Brittany. I was there to see Ethan. He stood behind the counter in the same uniform as every other associate. His posture was straighter, his face calmer, and for the first time in years, I saw a spark of humility in his eyes. He admitted to me later that it was the hardest job he had ever done. The long hours on his feet, the endless cycle of folding, greeting, and listening. But in that struggle, he began to discover something far more valuable than a paycheck. One afternoon, a widow came in. She looked nervous, as if she didn't belong in a place filled with polished glass and silk displays. Ethan told me how his first instinct had been to dismiss her, to steer her toward the clearance section. But he caught himself. Instead, he treated her as if she were the most important customer in the room. She left with nothing more than a $50 scarf, but her smile carried a weight that no sales figure could match. Hearing that story filled me with quiet pride. This was the lesson Thomas and I had always hoped our children would learn: that respect is priceless, and it costs nothing to give. Months passed before I heard Brittany's voice again. It came through the phone one evening, softer than I had ever known it. Gone was the sharp edge, the arrogance, the certainty that she always stood above others. What I heard instead was exhaustion, regret, and something that almost sounded like humility. She admitted that losing her job and then losing Ethan had forced her to see herself clearly for the first time. She told me she understood now that respect had nothing to do with titles or appearances. She said the hardest lesson of her life was realizing how she had treated people when she thought they had nothing to offer her. I listened quietly, letting her words settle in the silence. I knew her remorse was not about me, and not even about Ethan. It was about finally confronting the mirror she had avoided for so long. I didn't offer her forgiveness, because forgiveness is not something that can be rushed. But I did tell her that honesty, even when it comes late, is the first step toward dignity. When I hung up, I sat by the window and thought of Thomas. His words came back to me as they always did. Kindness is not weakness. Perhaps Brittany was finally beginning to understand what those words meant. Not long after, I gathered both of my children in the living room. Ethan looked tired but stronger, a man reshaped by humility. Claire sat beside him, steady and calm, always the quiet anchor in our family. On the table in front of us were 2 envelopes I had prepared long ago. I told them that what their father and I built was never just about profit. It was about protecting the values that gave our work meaning: respect, humility, and responsibility. Those values had to guide everything they inherited. I handed Ethan the first envelope. Inside were the documents for the boutiques and the factories, but there was a condition. He would inherit them only if he worked 5 full years in every level of the business. Beginning as a floor associate, he needed to learn from the ground up what it meant to serve. Claire received the second envelope, which contained properties and investments. A portion of that wealth would be dedicated to funding education for children in need. And I made one rule clear: if either of them ever used wealth to belittle others, they would lose everything. That night, After my children had gone home, I sat by the window and watched the sun sink below the horizon. The sky glowed in shades of orange and gold, and in that quiet, I felt Thomas's presence again. His words echoed in my heart, as they always did. Kindness is not weakness. Looking back, I realized that my silence at the funeral had been the seed of everything that followed. It opened the way for truth to surface, for Ethan to rediscover humility, for Claire to see the strength of values in action, and even for Brittany to confront the parts of herself she had long avoided. Life has a way of testing us in moments we least expect. Sometimes it happens in a chapel, sometimes on a sales floor, sometimes across a phone line filled with tears, but each time, the test is the same. Will we choose pride, or will we choose respect for me? The choice was clear. Respect builds legacies. Pride destroys them. And now, I want to ask you, have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you looked, or what people assumed about you? How did you respond? I'd love to hear your stories, because every lesson shared is a light for someone else. If this story touched you, I hope you'll like, share, and leave a comment below. Your voice matters more than you know.